Welcome to the 19th Century Novel Podcast, Episode 23, Honoré de Balzac, Cousin Pons, Part 1. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, one day in October 1844, an old man of some 60 years, though anyone who saw him would have thought him older, was walking along the Boulevard des Italiens with his nose thrust forward and a smug expression on his lips, like a merchant who has just made an excellent deal, or a bachelor emerging from a lady's boudoir pleased with his prowess. In Paris, the expression of male satisfaction can go no further. With this opening sentence, Balzac precisely establishes time and place and location, and introduces us to an old man who for some unexplained reason wears a prominent self-satisfied expression. Balzac goes on to note the bemused response of onlookers to this man's unusual appearance. His attire has an unconquerable fidelity to the modes of 1806. In 1844, meeting a man in such old-fashioned clothes made it seem as if Napoleon had deigned to come back to life for an hour or two. This man is, Balzac declares in his chapter title, a glorious relic of imperial times. Balzac then zooms in to describe his quaint comical face, which seemed to have no definite shape, a bone structure replaced with planes of gelatinous flesh, rounded out into flabby bulges. But his appearance does more than present a buffoonish character. This ludicrously exaggerated ugliness, Balzac writes, did not excite derision, for there was excessive melancholy abounding in this poor man's pale eyes. And to anyone looking closely at him, the thought came that nature had forbidden this man to make tender advances, because they could only awaken laughter or distress in a woman. In this depiction, we, the readers, have been placed in the position of Parisian street idlers puzzling over the appearance of this strangely comic yet tragic character. Had you been there, Balzac tells us, you would have wondered why a smile lit up this grotesque face, for its usual expression must have been sad and cold, like that of all people quietly struggling to meet the trivial needs of existence. This opening demonstrates Balzac's skill at delineating character through appearance, at establishing a novel's tone, in this case a comic pathos, at making the reader an active part of the narrative, and at withholding information to further our interest. We ask ourselves, who is this man? Where is he going? And what has produced this uncharacteristic, smug expression on his lips? We don't wait long for an answer. The opening of Chapter 2 reveals that he is Monsieur Sylvain Pons, a one-time prize-winning composer who survives now by conducting a theater orchestra, by giving music lessons, and by working as a music teacher at several girls' boarding schools, a job he holds thanks to his ugliness. No young girl, it is assumed, would surrender her heart or anything else to a man so ugly. He is a failed artist who in his clothes lives in the past, the time of his long-forgotten minor success, the author, Balzac discloses, of several well-known ballads that our mothers used to warble. He also had a few unpublished scores to his credit. In this portrait of an artist as an old man, Balzac is in a way creating an alternate portrait of himself, an imagining of what his life might have been if his artistic career had remained as it had begun. The pseudonymous author of Pot Boilers, 9 written in 5 years. About these early novels, Balzac biographer Graham Robb opines, After 1,000 pages, when the appetite for bludgeoning villains and helpless maidens begins to sicken, they can still be admired as detailed practical manuals on how to write popular romantic fiction. His lack of commercial success and critical recognition was such that the 27-year-old Balzac responded to one correspondent by alleging he'd given up his dead-end novelistic career. "Some time ago now," he wrote, "I condemned myself to oblivion after the public proved to me with some brutality that I was a mediocrity. I therefore took the public side in the matter, and dismissed the man of letters." Perhaps, too, there's an imagined future here, the 48-year-old Balzac imagining what might become of him as his art is superseded by younger writers, just as Pons's melodies were submerged under the flood of German harmony and the operas of Rossini. But what, you ask, about that smug smile? As a young man, Pons had traveled to Italy on an academic scholarship, where he developed a taste for antiquities and fine works of art. Using up his modest inheritance, Pons returned to Paris in 1810, laden with pictures, statuettes, frames, wood and ivory carvings, enamels, porcelains, etc. It was this habit which gave him a sense of purpose. As Balzac puts it, he found such lively compensation for his failure to reach fame in the pleasure his collecting gave him, that if he had to choose between the reputation of a Rossini and the possession of his curios, Pons would have preferred his beloved collection. Pons took pleasure in bargains, the thrill of paying little for antiques worth much more, a thrill nowadays seen on TV shows like Antiques Roadshow. In the pleasure Pons finds in his finds, we see yet again Balzac's own habits. Old Pons's art collection, asserts the novelist, translator, and biographer André Maurois, is the one Balzac would himself have liked to possess, and indeed believed he did possess. Pons's passion for antiques was Balzac's own. Balzac sees Pons's obsession as compensation for his emotional and sexual deprivation and the overall sadness of his life. To adopt a mania, he explains, is like applying a poultice to the soul. It can cure any weariness with life. This mania, however, can't fulfill Pons's other desire, to dine on the finest foods for free in the homes of the elite, a habit he developed when many years earlier he had been a popular composer worthy of filling out guest lists. During that time, which ended nearly 30 years before, he had got into the disastrous habit of dining well, of seeing his hosts sparing no expense, procuring out-of-season delicacies, uncorking the best wines, taking pains over the dessert, the coffee, and the liqueurs. But even as his popularity dwindled, his appetite remained. Denied sexual pleasure, he sought the pleasures of the gourmand, an habitual and ultimately an addictive behavior whose motives Balzac well understands. Sensual pleasure worms its way into every recess of the heart, establishes itself as sovereign, makes inroads into willpower and sense of honor, demands satisfaction at all costs. There is, I'll note, a physiological cause for this uncontrollable urge to consume gourmet foods, a rare condition known as Gourmand syndrome, in which, after an injury to the frontal lobe, there develops, explains Massimo Cusolaro, adjunct professor in the Department of Medical and Surgical Sciences at the University of Bologna, an abnormal preoccupation with preparing and eating fine quality food. The researchers Dr. Marianne Regard and Dr. Theodore Landis describe one case. A 48-year-old political journalist had had no particular interest in food before he suffered a hemorrhagic infarction in the territory of the middle cerebral artery. During his stay in the hospital, perhaps not unlike other patients before him, he complained of the hospital food, but his diary during that time showed the beginning of the preoccupation to come. It is time for a really hearty dinner, e.g., a good sausage with hash browns, or some spaghetti bolognese, or risotto, or some breaded cutlet, nicely decorated, or a scallop of game in cream sauce with spätzle. Where is the next oasis, with date trees and lamb roast or couscous and mint tea, the Moroccan way, real fresh? After recovering from his injury, this political journalist shifted to writing a food column. As much as Pons's gourmand obsession seems similar to this syndrome, though, there's no indication that his mania is the product of anything other than a psychological need. Balzac's understanding of the psychological need for fine food was influenced, he tells us, by food writer Jean-Anselme Brillat-Savarin, credited as the originator of the gastronomic essay, and best remembered for his 1821 volume, which has remained in print ever since, Physiology of Taste, or Meditations on Transcendent Gastronomy, theoretical, historical, and current work dedicated to Parisian gastronomes by a professor, member of several literary and learned societies, more commonly shortened to Physiologie du Goût, and translated into English under a variety of titles: The Physiology of Taste, or Transcendental Gastronomy, The Handbook of Dining, or How to Dine Theoretically, Philosophically, and Historically Considered, and most recently, The Pleasures of the Table. Appropriately, Brillat-Savarin is now probably best known as a type of cheese named for the famous gourmand, a soft triple cow's milk produced in the Burgundy and Normandy regions. Brillat-Savarin opens his book with a number of aphorisms, which would surely be endorsed by both the character Pons and his creator Balzac. Tell me what kind of food you eat, and I will tell you what kind of man you are. The discovery of a new dish confers more happiness on humanity than the discovery of a new star. The pleasure of the table mingles with all other pleasures, and remains at last to console us for their departure. Balzac expands upon the latter, on how the pleasure of eating can substitute for sexual pleasure. The digestive process brings all the human forces into play. It is a kind of inner combat which, for those who make a god of their bellies, gives as much enjoyment as sexual intercourse. Understanding that eating food and making love are responses to the same impulse, bodily desire, Balzac contends that in Paris the table competes with the trollop to bring people like Pons to their ruin. This understanding of human behavior, this interest in the causes of individual ruin, especially as it is driven by mania and obsession, lies at the heart of Balzac's fiction, as in Cousin Bette, where we observe Bette's ruin brought on by her desire for revenge, Valerie Marneffe's by her desire for wealth, Baron Hulot's by his sexual desire, and Annabelle Hulot's by desire to please her husband. So much does Pons desire gourmet foods that he's willing to debase himself, degenerating from the position of habitual guest to that of a sponger. He flatters, he runs errands, he spies on one family for another, he swallows his dignity in order to swallow haute cuisine. Or in Balzac's words, abject humiliation became his daily fare. The consumption of food and the acquisition of antiques, the filling of his belly and the filling of his apartment, compensate for Pons's unfulfilled desires. Explains Balzac, the small change of good food and bric-a-brac stood him in lieu of a woman's affection, for music was merely his profession. Ultimately, though, pottery and pâté don't compensate Pons for his loneliness. Fortunately, 8 years prior to the narrative present, Pons established a long-lasting human connection with Wilhelm Schmucke, a German-born composer and pianist, like Pons, a failed artist, a man who lacked the boldness to be a great composer, but whose humility marks him as one of the novel's few honest and humane characters. Pons works as orchestra director and occasional composer, and Schmucke as music copier and musician, playing piano and uncommon instruments such as the English horn and the viola d'amore, for a boulevard theater, that is, for one of the many popular theaters on the Boulevard du Temple, aka the Boulevard du Crime, where it was, writes Angela Powell, Indiana University professor emerita in comparative literature, situated amid a wide variety of street performers, carnival sideshows, puppet shows, cafes, gambling dens, and brothels. The aesthetic here, needless to say, was far from the distinguished classical aesthetic embraced by respectable theaters, the Comédie Française, the Comédie Italienne, and the opera. Struggling to get by on the fringes of the musical world with little ambition and mild temperaments, the comic duo of Pons and Schmucke are close friends, aging bachelors, they're around 60, who have lived together for nearly a decade. For economy's sake, Balzac says, on the third floor of a house in the Marais district, where they're served by two porters, Madame Cibot and her husband. As their titles suggest, the novel's Cousin Pons and Cousin Bette, written concurrently, are related, although the characters Pons and Bette are not. Both novels feature close same-sex relationships, Bette and Valerie Marneffe, Pons and Schmucke. As I wrote in episode 17, Bette has a strong romantic attachment. She adored Valerie. She had made her her daughter, her friend, her beloved. She found in her the docility of the Creole, the yielding nature of the voluptuary. She chatted with her every morning with much more pleasure than she had had in talking to Wenceslas. They could laugh over the mischief they were jointly planning over the folly of men. The relationship between Pons and Schmucke is, if anything, more intimate. Pons had, Balzac explains, contracted what was for him the only kind of marriage possible in his situation, wedlock with a man, an elderly man, a musician like himself. In a week they became like brothers. They expressed their bond through music, like lovers to persuade themselves of the truth of their convictions. More significant are the differences between these couples. Bette and Valerie are a mismatched pair, the former old and ugly, the latter young and beautiful, while Pons and Schmucke are nearly identical. Never perhaps in the sea of humanity, Balzac writes, had two souls found themselves so alike. Both novels are set in Paris in the 1830s and 1840s, where both couples, at least initially, subsist in a lower middle-class milieu within a post-July Revolution culture defined by the shallow materialist values of the bourgeoisie. But whereas Valerie and Bette are able to take advantage of this culture of greed, Pons and Schmucke find themselves alienated from its values and temper. Balzac explains their alienation. In Paris, especially since 1830, no one gets to the fore without thrusting aside, in whatever ways, a formidable throng of rivals. One needs excessively sturdy loins for this, and the two friends were suffering from the gravel in the heart which impedes all activity prompted by ambition. Having sturdier loins, Bette and Valerie are vengeful and lustful, seeking wealth and power. Content to live on their modest incomes, Pons and Schmucke have none of these traits, Balzac reversing gender roles, the women aggressive and conniving, the men passive and accepting. I've suggested that the pleasure Pons receives from collecting objets d'art compensates for the emptiness in his life, particularly his lack of close human connection. Yet Pons can't quit obsessively collecting even after connecting with Schmucke, because it provides him with pleasures Schmucke can't give him. To understand Pons's behavior, I draw from an essay by Frederick Bakeland, a one-time psychiatry professor who became a well-known collector of and dealer in Japanese art, someone seemingly uniquely qualified to explain the psychology of collecting. Pons derives pleasure from being a connoisseur, which elevates him from failed composer to expert collector, as we can see when he proudly and insufferably describes to relatives with whom he's dining how he discovered a rare and valuable fan, its images painted by Jean-Antoine Watteau, which he's given them as a gift. In the Rue de Lappe, from a dealer who had just brought in from a chateau near Dreux, which was being dismantled, a chateau where Madame de Pompadour sometimes resided before building Menard. The most splendid panelling known has been salvaged from there, so lovely that Linard, our celebrated woodcarver, has kept two of its oval frames for patterns, and as a ne plus ultra in craftsmanship. The chateau was full of surprises. The dealer in question discovered this fan in an inlaid cabinet. I would have bought it for myself if I collected such works, but the price is prohibitive. A piece of Riesener furniture is worth between 3,000 and 4,000 francs. People in Paris are beginning to realize that the famous German and French inlay workers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries used wood as a medium for real painting. It's up to a collector to be ahead of fashion. Why, in 5 years' time, Frankenthal porcelain, which I have been collecting for 20 years, will fetch as much as Sèvres soft paste. And what, you wonder, is Frankenthal porcelain? Pons is happy to explain. The name of the Elector Palatine's china factory, it is older than our Sèvres factory, just as the famous Heidelberg gardens, destroyed by Turenne, were so unlucky as to exist before the gardens of Versailles. Sèvres copied Frankenthal a great deal. One must do the Germans the justice of admitting that well before us they produced admirable ware in Saxony and the Palatine. This is the language of a monomaniac oblivious to social context and propriety. Pons's pride in his expertise overwhelms any sense of audience, his lecture causing mother and daughter to exchange glances as if Pons had been talking double Dutch. This self-absorption isn't new. For 20 years, Balzac records, Pons had been dining at the house of Camusots, his only real cousin, and the poor man was still waiting for a kindly inquiry about his own affairs, his life and health. Besides rewarding him with the refined knowledge of a connoisseur, the collecting of beautiful works of art satisfies aesthetic needs no longer satisfied by music. And collecting these rare and beautiful works can substitute for intimate relations with another. Baekeland observes that in collecting there is the ever-present possibility of making a find or undergoing what can be, like falling in love, one of life's most compelling experiences, irresistible attraction to a beautiful work of art, suffusion with the desire to own it, and finally, possession and enjoyment. The particular art Pons collects, most of it from the Renaissance through the 18th century, the elaborate finery of the Baroque and the Rococo, but nothing contemporary, suggests his discomfort with a present in which he struggles for respect, and it suggests a concomitant desire for a past where his talents might have been recognized and admired. For collectors, writes Baekeland, the art of the past represents a vision of order and fixity. By identifying with it, collectors are able to deny the primacy and transiency of the present. Collecting provides Pons with an identity, not determined by the whims of musical fashion and the impersonal materialism of Paris in the 1830s and 1840s. Balzac's understanding of the complex unconscious motivations of Pons's collecting mania, which mirrors much of Baekeland's analysis, is remarkably insightful, especially for someone writing in a culture with no developed science of psychology. Just as he continues to collect, so, despite the comfort he finds in Schmucke, Pons continues to desire fine foods. Unable to go cold turkey, he continues trying to feed his habit, while the mounting difficulties render his occupation as a parasite more and more painful, and so is forced to turn as a last resort to his rich relatives. The Pons family's fortune was built upon an embroidery business established by two Pons brothers. It's where Bette works in Cousin Bette. One of the wonders of Balzac's Comédie Humaine is precisely this interconnection of characters across novels. At times, though, the unspooling of these character and family relationships can become eye-glazing, as if a distant cousin at a family reunion were detailing all of the fractions and numbers and removes and steps of relationships between you and him. To luxuriate in, for instance, a plate of capon with Parisian truffle sauce and a Burgundian Chardonnay, Pons tries to exploit his family ties, as Balzac here elaborates. Our one-time laureate was first cousin to the first wife of Monsieur Camusots, the rich silk merchant established in the Rue des Bourdonnais. She had been Mademoiselle Pons, sole heiress of one of the famous brothers Pons, embroiderers by royal appointment. The musician's parents had been sleeping partners in this firm, which they founded before the Revolution of 1789. It had been bought in 1815 by a Monsieur Rivet, from the first Madame Camusot's father. Pons wormed his way as a kinsman of the Camusots into the extensive Cardot family. These formed a second middle-class clan which, through intermarriage, constituted a whole society no less influential than that of the Camusots. Cardot, the notary, a brother of the second Madame Camusot, had married a Mademoiselle Chiffraville. Pons lined up behind the Camusots and the Cardots, and gained access to the Chiffarilles and thence to the Popinots, still as a cousin of other cousins. Don't worry, this won't be on the test. Suffice it to say that Pons tries to use family ties, however remote, to satisfy his cravings for fine food. These relatives are confronted by a distant cousin, if that, who appears unannounced at dinner time and who offers as recompense long-winded and esoteric discourses on collectible curios, without condescending to discuss matters of personal or family interest. A man, in Balzac's words, who racks his brains for one of those obsequious replies which always occurred to him too late. A man, in other words, incapable of the gossip and small talk these social gatherings demand. This inability to fit in, to ingratiate himself with his hosts, and his inability to recognize his inability to fit in, to understand what an odd and boring burden he's perceived to be, is the beginning of his downfall. This incident occurs at a dinner at the home of Madame Marie-Cécile Amélie Camusot de Marville, known as Présidente, the wife of the Président of the Royal Court of Justice. Note: Balzac refers to the wife of the Président as Présidente, that is, the word Président, ending with a feminine silent E, to evoke her control over her husband and her overall domineering character. To avoid the confusion of the nearly identically pronounced titles Président and Présidente, I will refer to them as Monsieur and Madame Camusot. At this dinner, Madame Camusot is handed a page from her 23-year-old daughter Cécile, which offers a plan to dispose of the irksome Pons. If we made out, dear mamma, that this note was sent from the law courts by my father, telling you to bring me for dinner to his friends for further talks about my marriage, Cousin Pons would go away, and we could carry out our plan to go to the Papineaus. Cécile's mother plays along with this ruse, excusing her and her daughter's departure, and telling him he can stay and eat the already prepared dinner, since otherwise it would be eaten by the servants. Passing by Cécile's door, Pons sees her shaking with laughter and speaking to her mother in the language of nods and grimaces, which tells Pons he is being had. As a result, he resolves to never again go anywhere without an invitation. To make matters worse, he hears the maid Madeleine tell the other servants that the masters in the houses where he dines find him such a bore that he will be thrown out everywhere. Learning that Pons has overheard her insults, Madeleine is unrepentant. What does it matter, she asks. Bad luck for him, good luck for us. The stingy old beggar's done for. It's a testament to Balzac's skill as a novelist that he can depict Pons as tedious and comically obsessive, yet make us sympathize with him, that he can elicit pathos from something as slight as a man losing his fancy dinner privileges, and that he can make us understand that to Pons this loss and attendant recognition of his own social marginality is traumatic. Pons leaves in a daze, hurried along in fits and starts, his wounded self-respect urging him on, returning home with what Balzac calls a most unusual thing. He had lost all appetite for food. At this point, Balzac shifts his focus to Pons's and Schmucke's home. They reside in a second-floor flat of a former three-story mansion. On the first floor is a shop run by Monsieur Raymond Oncle, a scrap iron merchant who has broadened his interests to become a dealer in curiosities, and who is well aware of Pons's standing in bric-a-bracery. To cook lunch for both men, and dinner for Schmucke, and to do their housekeeping, cleaning, mending, shopping, laundering, Pons and Schmucke rely on the caretakers Monsieur and Madame Cibot. In describing the latter, Balzac makes clear the toll enacted by working-class life. Hot gusts from the kitchen buffet and coarsen their features. Leavings from bottles of wine shared with the waiters seep through to their complexion, and no bloom is more quickly over than the bloom of a comely oyster girl. 48 years and mustachioed, she remains a fitting model for a Rubens canvas, although her rivals call her a fat lump. She reigns over the two men with maternal care. When she found that the two men were as docile as children, easy to get on with, very trusting, just like a couple of children, Balzac explains, her plebeian kind-heartedness prompted her to protect, adore, and serve them with such genuine devotedness that she scolded them on occasions and defended them against all the swindling in Paris. When Pons returns early from his spoiled dinner, he's greeted with astonishment by Madame Cibot, while Schmucke, seeing his friend's despair, attempts to placate him by saying they can go antiquing, even though he has no appreciation for Pons's collection, which he has gazed at, writes Balzac, as a fish would gaze at a flower show. Pons goes 3 months without dining out, pining for the choice dishes, the liqueurs, the excellent coffee, the small talk, the insincere civilities, the varied company, and the scandal-mongering. Balzac again describes Pons's gustatory desire in sexual terms. He is like an elderly gallant who yearns for a discarded mistress, guilty though she may be of countless infidelities. Someone hearing him sigh, notes Balzac, would have imagined that the good man was thinking of an absent mistress, but he had something more rare in mind, a succulent carp. Balzac also suggests a connection between his appreciation for art and for fine food. Pons yearned for certain kinds of creme, each one a poem, for certain white sauces, each one a masterpiece. Pons is unable to hide his grief over the demise of his dinners, and thus his fellow musicians note his signs of unhappiness, weakness, and decline, a diminuendo prompted by what Balzac labels Pons's gastric nostalgia. Leaving the declining Pons, Balzac takes us to Frankfurt-am-Main, the current city of Frankfurt, Germany, but which at the time was a city-state within the German Confederation. Here we learn from one of Pons's musicians, the flautist Werther, during intermission of a performance of the operetta The Devil's Beloved, the history of Fritz Brunner, a man sitting near the stage wearing yellow gloves and radiating opulence, and tricked out with all a banker's elegance. Although now wealthy, this man clearly has suffered on his way to riches. The constant self-prostitution which life in Paris entails had blurred his gaze and put shadows round those eyes. More than Paris, Balzac continues, this young man was the handiwork of a stepmother. After the death of Fritz's Jewish mother, his father married a good German girl, the daughter of another innkeeper. An only daughter idolized by her parents, she was ill-natured and flighty, and she squandered her husband's money and avenged the first Frau Brunner by giving her husband a home life which made him the unhappiest man known throughout the territory. No kinder to young Fritz, she seems almost a wicked stepmother freed from the pages of Cinderella. This archetypal monster appeared in a French version published by Charles Perrault in 1697. The first French translation of Grimm's fairy tales, which also included a version of the story, appeared in 1824. Balzac's description of Fritz's wicked stepmother would fit into either of these. This hyena was so much the more furious with the cherubic son of the handsome first Frau Brunner, narrates Balzac, because, though she puffed and strained like a railway engine, she could produce no offspring. With diabolic cunning, this wicked woman launched young Fritz at 21 into a career of dissipation. She hoped that English ponies, Rhenish vinegar, and Gretchen à la Goethe would destroy him and his fortune. Rhenish vinegar is Balzac's contemptuous term for German wine. Gretchen à la Goethe refers to a character in Goethe's Faust. Fritz's mother, in other words, hopes her stepson will be lost to drink, women, and gambling. And he succeeds in this moral failure to such a remarkable degree that every family still holds him up as a bogey to frighten their children and keep them on the straight and narrow path. For his wastrel ways, Fritz's father, a successful innkeeper, denied him food and drink, hearth and home, and even tobacco. At his father's urging, the local authorities banished him on a trumped-up charge. Fritz wandered off to Strasbourg, where he met Wilhelm the flautist and helped him waste his inheritance, squandering all their money in the beer-houses in the most stupid and vulgar manner, in the company of ballet dancers and Alsatian girls. Their money spent, the two young men journeyed to Paris, were able to take advantage of the generosity of Johann Graf, who had been head waiter at Fritz's father's hotel, who now runs the Hotel du Rhin, where he allows them to stay in the attic, and who finds them jobs, Fritz as a clerk, Wilhelm as a bookkeeper, before joining Pons's theater orchestra. After 7 years of barely getting by, Fritz has discovered that his father has died and has left him a huge inheritance, having made a fortune as one of the promoters of railroads in Baden. The Grand Duchy of Baden opened a rail line from Mannheim to Heidelberg in 1840. By the time of the novel's setting, the line had extended to the spa town of Baden-Baden, and Fritz's father's wealth had grown to 4 million francs, some of which will be shared with his friend. Fritz this time hopes to escape his stepmother's curse by investing with Wilhelm in a startup banking venture. Not only Wilhelm's, but Pons's fortune seems to be turning, although the Présidente, Madame Camusots, lost no sleep for being delivered of her parasite, her husband, who never felt put upon by Pons's visits, and with whom he had been friends for 40 years, wants to know why he stopped visiting, especially after having given them the exquisite fan whose beauty and craftsmanship and value was recognized by his acquaintances. Meanwhile, other people he used to visit have started wondering what happened to Pons. Encountering one such former dinner host, Count Popinot, the Minister of Finance, who asks him why he's disappeared, Pons alludes to the Camusots, saying, "I never did get much welcome there," and in fact was humiliated. As a result, Pons declares, "I have resigned from my post as hanger-on." Count Popinot confronts Monsieur Camusot about this abuse, who confronts his wife and daughter, who in turn blame their servants, who thus are forced to visit Pons and apologize. In the end, Pons is returned to society, transfigured. The gloomy, moribund old man gave way to the self-satisfied Pons, a transformation that disappoints Schmucke, since he'll have to forego the happiness to himself for nearly 4 months of sharing dinners with Pons. The first stop on Pons's re-entry into society is a banquet in honor of the flautist Schwab's engagement, which is held at a mansion on the Rue de Richelieu, home to the wealthy tailor Wolfgang Graf, where the newlyweds will live, and where the offices of Brunner, Schwab and Company will be situated. It was on the Rue de Richelieu, by the way, that a few years earlier Auguste Zang, an Australian artillery officer who had started a Viennese bakery, Boulangerie Viennoise, modified an existing Austrian roll called Kipferl, creating that buttery perfection, the croissant. Far more than croissants are served at the catered banquet. There were dishes to send you into raptures, writes Balzac, such delicious vermicelli as had never been tasted before, fried smelts which dissolved in the mouth, a farra from Geneva in a real Genevese dressing, and a sauce for plum pudding which would have astonished the London doctor who is said to have invented it. Farra is a freshwater whitefish native to Lake Geneva that was last found in 1920 and which presumably has become extinct due to overfishing and species hybridization. I think Genovese dressing is a pesto sauce. The traditional sauce for plum pudding is made from cream and brandy. I'm not sure what doctor is alleged to have invented plum pudding. Perhaps, though unlikely, this notion is related to the title of one of the first cookbooks to include a plum pudding recipe, Mary Kettleby's 1714, a collection of above 300 receipts in cookery, physic, and surgery. On the way to this feast, Pons hits upon the idea to secure himself a place in this society and at the dinner table of helping to arrange a marriage between the newly wealthy Fritz Brunner and Cécile Camusots de Marville, the young girl who had contrived the false letter which had led to Pons's exile. He tells himself they will be tremendously obliged to their hanger-on. The very next day he proposes this potential proposal to Cécile and her family. In what follows, Balzac takes us through the stages preparatory to an upper-class marriage. First, discover the potential husband's financial status. Cécile expressed approval of his generosity, since it's known he's given his friend Wilhelm 500,000 francs. Second, learn if he's good-looking. Learn about Frederick's clothes, his height, his appearance, the color of his hair and eyes. Pons tells her that he's over 40 and he's half bald. Third, determine his motive. We must have time to collect information, says Madame Camusot. Never will I give over my daughter to a nobody. Pons reveals that he's looking for family life as a haven of refuge. Fourth, arrange to meet him without committing to anything further. Pons says a mere one interview with Fritz will confirm his qualities, and they can make acquaintance of the prospective bridegroom without committing themselves by visiting his flat, where Fritz will be viewing his art collection. Pons is ecstatic when his wealthy guests appear in his modest, art-filled apartment, both because of the good he was doing and the future he saw looming ahead. More dinners like the one he had had at the signing of Werther's marriage contract. His rooms are filled with priceless art. Floral studies by Van Weisman and David van Heim, Abraham Mignon's insects, the canvases of Van Eyck and Albrecht Dürer, the genuine works by the elder Cranach, the Giorgione, the Sebastian del Piombo, the Bakhuyzen, the Habermas, the Géricault. The artists here are German, Dutch, and Italian painters from the 15th to the 18th centuries, with the exception of Théodore Géricault, a French painter from the 19th century. They're known for a wide variety of genres: portraits, still lifes, landscapes, and devotional scenes. all of which his relatives ignore, having no thought for anything but this fiancé with his 4 millions. Nothing stirred their curiosity, for they were waiting for the solar deity who was to light up these riches. This Philistinism, this lack of appreciation for or knowledge of fine art is, for Balzac, an indictment of the bourgeois values that have come to dominate Parisian society. Ignoring these paintings, Pons's guests appreciate only those objets d'art which seem to exhibit monetary value, jewelry and fancy snuff boxes. Little attention is paid to Pons's paintings until Fritz tells Cécile he would pay 800,000 francs for them. Per the nuptials, Fritz is asked to join Pons for a dinner at the Camusots. But he's unenthusiastic, telling Pons that Cécile's nothing to get excited about, and her mother a bit prim. To which Pons reminds Fritz that she has a fine fortune, more than 1 million. As they part, Fritz offers Pons 500,000 or 600,000 francs for his collection, but Pons says he would never part with things that give him such happiness, and would in fact only part with them after his death. Pons then watches the carriage take Fritz away, without noticing, ominously, that Raymond, the curio dealer, whose shop is on the first floor, had been standing nearby, and had overheard Fritz's bartering for Pons's collection. That very night Madame Camusot begins to spread the news that her daughter will be marrying a young German setting up as a banker. He has a capital of 4 millions. He's a hero straight out of a novel, a real Werther, charming, good-hearted, with all his wild oats sown. He has fallen madly in love with Cécile, love at first sight. When Fritz appears for dinner at the Camusots, he joins 11 guests, not just family members, but the Minister of Justice, his Chief Justice, and the Attorney General. Its purpose was, through the prestige of the guests, to get Monsieur Brunner definitely committed. The Camusots are so pleased that they offer Pons a lifetime annual income, an offer that makes the blood tingle in his ears, and all the gas jets in the footlights of his theater seemed to be flaring up before his eyes. An offer that Fritz correctly interprets as payment for services rendered. Fritz also notices how completely Cécile, the idol of the household, was spoiled by her father and mother, which leads him to ask if she's an only child, and when told she is, Fritz's face clouded over, and an ominous silence brought a strange chill to the atmosphere. It's as if Fritz had been told that Cécile is an epileptic. Shocked by this sudden change in Fritz's demeanor, Monsieur Camusot takes him aside and asks if he had been sincere about seeking his daughter's hand. Fritz says he had indeed come to propose, but can't do so now because of what he's just discovered. Cécile is an only child. To Fritz, this condition is an absolute impediment, for an only daughter is a child whom her parents' indulgence accustoms to doing as she pleases, and whose will has never been crossed. He goes on to explain that his stepmother, the cause of all his misfortunes, an only daughter, an object of worship, the most charming of fiancées, became a fiend incarnate. Hiding in her mother's dressing room and hearing everything, Cécile emerges after Fritz's departure, deathly pale, and faints in her mother's arms, causing Madame Camusot to address the innocent Pons. This will be the death of my daughter, and you have killed her. Because of this humiliating rejection of their daughter, the Camusots must salvage their daughter's and their family's reputation. They must first make it appear that they, not Fritz, canceled the marriage, and so they denigrate the once groomed-to-be Fritz Brunner as unsuitable, emphasizing, to accomplish this goal, his lower-class roots. This son of a German innkeeper, the nephew of a rabbit-skin merchant, this German's best friend is a sorry individual who plays the flute. He's in league with a man who runs a lodging-house and a family of tailors. One can see by his gloves that he belongs to the working classes. A German cook-shop keeper for a father, no refinement of feeling, a beer drinker. Heaven has preserved us from that. The second step in salvaging the Camusot reputation is to explain that they were duped. For this, they need a scapegoat. "I can see through the plot this person has hatched," said the outraged mother, pointing to Pons. Pons started up as if the trumpet blast of Judgment Day had sounded in his ears. Madame Camusot's eyes were like twin pools of green bile. "Monsieur," she continued, "you decided to do us a wrong in return for an innocent jest. I hope, Monsieur Pons, that in future you will spare us the displeasure of seeing you in a house on which you have tried to bring shame and dishonor." Pons stood like a statue, stared down at a rose pattern in the carpet, and twiddled his thumbs. "What? You are still here? Ungrateful monster!" cried Madame Camusot. Having been on the verge of a lifetime stipend and a permanent dinner invitation, Pons is devastated by these accusations. He walked through the streets to his theatre, which he entered in a daze. He went to his stand in a daze, and conducted the orchestra in a daze. To have reawakened fearful hatred in persons whose happiness he had tried to ensure meant that his whole existence was turned upside down. Thankfully, Schmucke is there to help the distraught and destroyed Pons, who spends a month in bed suffering from nervous fever, until at last he seeks to recover by strolling through the Paris streets, unaware of how in the interim he has been defamed by Madame Camusot, who had alleged that he introduced that fine gentleman to us in order to make a laughing-stock of us. It was, she says, a piece of vengefulness on the part of Monsieur Pons. This allegation has spread throughout their society, with no one to stand up for this outsider, that sly, miserly parasite, that wolf in sheep's clothing, henceforth buried under a weight of scorn, written off as a viper nourished in the family bosom, an extraordinarily wicked man, a dangerous mountebank, best consigned to oblivion. Unaware of the pariah he's become, Pons is shocked when he encounters Count Papineau, the finance minister, who had once sought to reconcile him with the Camusots. "Please understand, monsieur, that from now on we have absolutely no dealings with one another. My wife, the Countess, shares the indignation which everyone in society feels with regard to your behavior." Later he runs into a young woman who had had enough unhappiness in her life to incline her to indulgence. A lapse from virtue which had been hushed had made her husband's slave. Yet even this woman, the victim of social outrage over an extramarital affair, is agitated by Pons's presence, telling him, "I did not think you were a bad man, cousin, but if only 1/4 of all I have heard said about you is true, you are a very deceitful person." Only his close friend Schmucke remains an ally, while Pons's health declines. "This walk," Balzac declares, "was to be the last the good Pons ever took." Stumbling from one sickness to another, Pons is treated by a doctor who lives in a poor neighborhood on the Rue de Normandie in the Marais. Access to health care was difficult in the Marais and in other poor parts of the city because doctors mostly served the wealthier neighborhoods. They tended to concentrate where professional rewards were greatest. Paris, for example, had 1,231 doctors in 1851, but 720 lived in 3 arrondissements, with only 31 living in the Marais. The neighborhood physician, Dr. Poulain, who often tended to the poor, explains to Madame Cibot that Pons is doomed because of his low spirits, but that if well cared for and given a change of scene, he might pull through. She knows, though, that Pons probably cannot afford such treatment, leading Dr. Poulain to lament that his life is spent watching people die, not of disease, but of that grave and incurable injury, shortage of money. At last recognized for his connoisseurship, praised for finding an eligible suitor, promised a yearly stipend, welcomed to the homes of the wealthy, and guaranteed many a fine dinner, the unassuming and well-intentioned Pons, almost overnight, is banished from proper society, its dining tables emptied, its doors slammed shut, his only comfort, his art treasures, and his friend Schmucke. Balzac ends this chapter not by focusing on Pons's health or his relationship with Schmucke, but by turning his attention to what have been up to this point 2 minor characters, his landlady, Madame Cibot, and the tin merchant / curio seller, Remononc. The good woman Madame Cibot, who had displayed real maternal care for her bachelor boarders, expresses to Remononc her concern for Pons's health and his inability to pay for the care he needs. But Remononc assures her that he's richer than all of the owners of curiosity shops. I know enough in that line of business to tell you that the dear man has a gold mine of treasures. Referring to the conversation Remononc had overheard, Fritz's offer to buy Pons's collection, Balzac writes, "In Paris there is no greater danger than gossiping at front entrances. The tail end of a conversation may be dangerously indiscreet both for those who let themselves be overheard and for those who overhear it. The truth of this observation our narrative is about to illustrate." For a transcript of this episode, along with the bibliography and other materials, please go to 19thcenturynovel.podbean.com.